Sarah Rosengartner. Is that?
That's great. Yeah.
That's okay. Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
So I think we're ready to start, lady. I'm going to go ahead. Hi, everyone, and welcome. Hi, everyone. Welcome back again to the People's Migration Challenge, round 4, session 5. So we've done quite a few of these already, and really great to see all of you. We've been talking about climate, especially for a number of times. So we're very excited to be hosting again another session on climate, this time with different people coming to speak from local authorities and cities perspective. So we're very happy to have that with us. But first, let me introduce our guest moderator for the day, Lidi Nakbil. I'm really excited to have Lidi. Thank you for coming back and joining us in our migration people's movements here. Lidi joined us a few months ago in another session, in a prep session for the GFMD, and really blew away the room and really shook things up. So I'm expecting her to do the same again today, Lidi. But let me do the proper and introduce Lidi properly here today. Lidi, of course, is the coordinator of the Asian People's Movement on Depth and Development, APMDD, the co-coordinator of the global campaign to demand climate justice, which is very relevant today, and also a co-convener of the Asian Energy Network and vice president of the Freedom from Debt Coalition based in the Philippines. On APMDD, of course, APMDD is a regional alliance of people's movements, community organizations, coalitions, NGOs and networks that believes in social transformation that is all-encompassing and interrelated. And particularly exciting to us, it's also its contribution to the social transformation. It focuses on people-centered development, economic and environmental rights and justice, which is very relevant to our discussions around migration and migrant rights. Lidi, of course, is a veteran of a number of COPs, conference of the parties. I think that's where we keep running into each other, Lidi, and I think the last time probably Bali or Paris, and every time I see her there, every time I see her in a session, she's very fired up and also really, really engaging in talking truth to power. That's always very striking to me. So thank you again, Lidi, for joining us, and thank you for leading us through this session. Very, very important and exciting session today. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Colin, for that very kind and generous introduction. I'd like to wish everyone a good evening from Manila. It's about a little past 9 o'clock in the evening, and I can see we're from all over the world, I guess. So we're in different time zones. So it's a good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I'd like to start the session, and this probably was already mentioned in the 2 other sessions on climate, by recalling 2 of the most important messages of the recent IPCC AR6 report, number 1, with the first part of that report that was released only last August. One is that the report tells us that warming of the planet has reached 1.09 degrees Celsius past pre-industrial levels, 1.09 degrees Celsius. And just about 3 or 4 years ago, we were talking about reaching past 0.8, almost 0.9 degrees Celsius, and now we're already way past 1 degree. And this tells us that we are so close to the critical point of 1.5 degrees temperature rise, which the Paris Agreement, one of its goals is that we need to keep below that we're aiming to keep below that, because 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees is already a very critical point when we can call it, we're reached a point of runaway climate change. The other thing that the report is saying is that the warming rate is growing faster. So it's not just warming, the rate of warming is faster and escalating. And I'm sorry to say there's actually a third point that I'd like to emphasize. They are saying that if we don't act now towards climate change in the next few years, this is a very critical decade, then that goal of keeping below 1.5 degrees will be lost. That this will be beyond reach, they're saying. So rather than just talk about what the goals will be like midpoint century, what we need to do about climate change in the next few years is very critical. So it's very important and very critical that we talk about this, that we link it to one of the most critical challenges that people face today, and that is migration. And I'm very happy to have heard that you have had 2 wonderful discussions already on this, and we're looking forward to this one. When one of the jobs I've been given is to try to summarize in 1 minute a very important paper that has come out from the 2 previous discussions, and I think all of you have a copy of that 1-pager, to which our speakers are going to be asked to reflect on. And I just like to mention the key points that this paper contains in terms of actions to address impacts. So our job is not to just prevent reaching runaway climate change. A very critical part of that is also to address impacts, most of which are actually irreversible. And scientists are telling us impacts will actually grow worse before we will be able to stabilize climate change. So the first very important point is working with local authorities and getting resources to the local level. This is really a very extremely important starting point. We need to work at the local level, and we need to get local authorities to act, and how to get the resources at the local level. The second point is about ensuring women's participation and agency. And as a woman, I believe this is also an extremely essential point. We always like to say there can be no climate justice without gender justice. And part of gender justice is ensuring the agency of women in the whole process. The third point is migration as adaptation. Movement of people as adaptation, or migration as adaptation, depends on the context and depends on support. A fourth point is that finance is a big issue, and I can also echo this very strongly, working on climate finance as one of our contributions, especially getting finance and support to the local level where people need it most. The fifth point is about internal and international migration and displacement, and the relationship between them must be in the frame of approaching migration and climate. Internal and international migration and the relationship between these two. The sixth point is just transition and the importance of decent work for migrant workers and everyone. Indeed, just transition must squarely be part of the principle and practice of the entire process. And finally, a very important point, there is need for more data, but more data should not be substitute for concrete action. So the final point is about data and action. So that's, I hope, a good summary of the important points of that 1-pager. And we're now going to move to our panel of speakers. They have been requested to give their reflection on the messages of this 1-pager. If these points are possible, any suggestions in taking these points forward? Can local government authorities be an ally in working towards achieving the action points? Can local governments, authorities, and civil society work together? And if there are existing partnerships, we would like to hear your examples of your experiences of these existing partnerships. So we're very happy to have 2 speakers with us today. The first speaker will be Mr. Lokendra Takar, who is from India. He is presently the General Manager at the Center for Climate Change and Sustainable Development and State Coordinator of the Government of Madhya Pradesh State Knowledge Management Center on Climate Change, or the long acronym SKMCCC, at EPCO, Department of Environment. He is also officer in charge of the State Wetland Authority of the Government of Madhya Pradesh and currently holding the charge of principal EPCO Institute of Environmental Studies. He's leading the team at SKMCCC to revise the State Climate Change Action Plan for the state. So tonight we will be hearing from him, Mr. Lokendra Takar. Over to you.
Thank you, ma'am, for such a nice opening remarks, and also thanks for the nice words that you spoke about me. Happy to be this participating in this very important discourse on climate change and migration. I come from a state of Madhya Pradesh because I see a lot of people who are out of India and international audience. So just want to give you a brief update as to where we come from. Madhya Pradesh is the central state of the country of India, central province, and it is landlocked and the second largest state of the country. The state is vulnerable to climate change for a variety of reasons. One of the most important reason is that MP's population is about 70 million, and about 30 to 40% people are still below poverty line. So this is one of the most important indicator that the people of Madhya Pradesh are quite vulnerable to climate change. Secondly, most of the majority of the people of the state are dependent for their livelihoods on natural resources like agriculture, like water, like forest. And these poor and small marginal farmers who live in villages, they are dependent for their livelihoods on climate sensitive sectors. Therefore, any change in climate brings a lot of adversity for these people, and therefore climate change has a lot of impact on the socio-economic and ecological aspects of the state of Madhya Pradesh. Many studies have been carried out by international agencies, by Government of India, and by our own knowledge center in Madhya Pradesh. We have carried out these climate change vulnerability assessment studies. And as far as as the studies suggest, we have about 52 districts in Madhya Pradesh. Out of these 52 districts, 11 districts are quite high in terms of their vulnerability. Very high vulnerability of 11 districts. I'm talking in the mid-century, and in the end century, the number of districts which are going to be highly vulnerable to climate change are 9. We have about 15 districts which are highly vulnerable, about 11 are moderately vulnerable, and 10 districts are low in terms of their vulnerability. What I mean to say is that about 40 districts are categorized as vulnerable in terms of climate change. What does it mean for us? It means that majority of the people of Madhya Pradesh are quite vulnerable to climate change. If we look at the rainfall and temperature projections, which we have studied and carried out those kinds of studies in the state of Madhya Pradesh, the studies suggest that there is possibility of 4.4% of increased rainfall in the mid-century in state of Madhya Pradesh. If we look at the end century, the 24.7% rainfall is likely to be increased. In terms of temperature, the study suggests that about 1.3 degrees centigrade of temperature rise in mid-century, whereas in end century, the rise in temperature is about projected to be 2 degrees centigrades. So if we take these 2-3 indicators, highly vulnerable, 40% people are still below poverty line, about 40 districts, that means about 70-80% of geographical area of the state are vulnerable to climate change in different, of course, in different categories, from extremely highly vulnerable to highly vulnerable and low vulnerable. And rainfall is likely to increase both in mid-century and end century, and temperature is likely to increase both in mid-century and end century. This is very clear picture as to how people are going to be affected as far as climate change is concerned. And how does it relate to it? I would give you just an example of recent last month, when the rains stop. But in areas which were never historically were never had any serious floods, had unprecedented rainfall, unprecedented flooding situation, and thousands of people, millions of people were affected by the floods. And what does it mean? It means that those people, poor farmers who are living in the villages dependent on natural resources for their livelihoods, have to move out of their areas, have to go they are forced to migrate from their areas and go to urban areas for their 1 square meal. Therefore, climate induced migration is very clearly visible, evident in states like Madhya Pradesh. MP traditionally, historically, is not a flood-prone area. There are occasions of floods, but unlike Assam and Bihar and coastal areas, which are always have the instances of flooding, MP has no such experiences. But recently, we have seen in areas which are in northern area, we have seen unprecedented floods. Therefore, my studies and our experience say that climate change is impacting the socio-economic structure of the state. It is impacting the poor people. It is forcing them to move out of their traditional homes and migrate. I'm not against migration. It has always been a coping mechanism for poor people when they have to go out for their livelihoods. But it is bad when they are forced to do it. And this is where the problem is. They don't want to move. They have enough resources to manage their affairs at their own villages. But when climate extremes are happening, they are forced to migrate and they have to fend for themselves. So this is what I wanted to share from my MP experience from this subnational level, the second largest state of the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Takar. We're going to hear from our next speaker, Ms. Sarah Rosengartner, who is currently a visiting researcher at the Zollberg Institute on Migration and Mobility at the New School in New York. She also serves as an advisor to the C40 MMC Global Mayors Task Force on Climate and Migration and supports the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative, a joint effort of the African Union Commission, the UN, and the World Bank. Sarah also previously worked with the Open Society Foundations, where she helped set up the Mayors Migration Council, the GFMD Mayors Mechanism, and the Africa-Europe Mayors Dialogue at the Columbia University and at the United Nations. So Sarah?
Thank you, Liddy, and thank you everybody for inviting me. I'm a newcomer to these conversations, but I very much look forward to our conversation today and to hearing from all of you. I'll frame my remarks maybe against the backdrop of these two efforts that I'm currently supporting. Both of them are in a way organizing efforts. One involves mayors and cities, and it's two city networks coming together. On the one hand, the C40 network, which brings together mayors on climate action, and on the other hand, the Mayors Migration Council, which seeks to do the same around migration policy. So these two networks have come together and rallied mayors to jointly look at what's the role of cities on climate and migration. The other effort that I'm supporting is this Africa Climate Mobility Initiative, which is a multi-stakeholder effort. So cities are one of the stakeholders, but it is very much also targeted towards governments, international organizations, civil society, the private sector. We're really aiming to build a very big tent there. And the goal for that effort is to come to COP27, so next year's COP, not this year's COP, with a joint African agenda on climate forced mobility and what it means for the continent. So my remarks will be very much based on these two efforts that I'm engaged with and less kind of a grassroots experience. Maybe I'll start with some reflections as you invited us, Liddy, on the paper that you shared. And I have to say, I find it very encouraging that there is a lot of convergence, I think, in terms of the messaging and the approach that is proposed. especially with the work that we've been doing now with a group of cities to develop their own messaging and an agenda for action that they want to present this year at COP. And I'll just name a few of the clear convergences that I see. I think the emphasis on climate action needing to be people-centered, or the approach that we take to climate and migration needing to be people-centered. The acknowledgement that there are very big issues around equity and making sure that we pay attention to who is more vulnerable and how do our actions distribute the costs and benefits across different groups of people. Also, cities have been very much on board and sharing practical examples of kind of working with migrants and working with communities. So this idea of co-creating solutions and how do we ensure participation of people in the policies that affect them. Strong emphasis on the need for finance and data at the local level. So really making sure that data, serves the people who need to take action. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is like a lot of rallying around the need for data, but often very driven also by security or finance agenda. And so this idea of like putting data at the disposal of people who actually need to make decisions in their day-to-day lives, I think is still something where, there's progress to be made and interest from city leaders. On finance, I can speak in a little bit more detail, like what we are putting forward there in terms of ideas, but it's definitely a very big part of the agenda. And then also on just transition. So the angle there is strongly around how can we use just transition measures for inclusion of migrants and refugees who may already be in cities or internally displaced people. But also, is it an opportunity to open up new avenues for mobility? And you're highlighting there the issue of like what kinds of mobility, right? And what kinds of regimes. And I think that brings me to one of the areas where I think we're still a little bit vague. I think you and the mayors too. Which is to basically say, I think there's this acknowledgement climate change is exacerbating inequality. What does that mean for migration, right? Does that mean more people moving or less people moving? I think that's one question. And I think the UK government did a recent rapid assessment that highlighted again this dynamic of migration needs resources. And so often people will actually not be able to move. And so I think that question is there, and you highlight this people needing support to move for adaptation, that this is not a given that people can just do this and use migration as an adaptation tool without receiving support, and that the discourse is there, but the support is not there. I think you're leaving a little bit more open what would be an adequate policy response. There's a call for this, and you're, I think, rightly pointing out that existing tools are there, like refugee protection, temporary protection measures, temporary work schemes, like there's a toolbox that governments can use basically. But I think what that leaves open, at least in my mind, and that's something that I was wondering about how you would think about this, is this more collective dimension, right? Like when we're not just speaking about individuals, and I think one of your postcards acknowledged this question of like collective loss, basically, due to climate change. What if whole communities need to move? That's often, I think, framed in terms of planned relocation. But I wonder if that is kind of the biggest gap to think about, like what would a regime look like that doesn't just address individual cases, but addresses community and collective migration, need to move, before maybe it becomes a humanitarian crisis. Then I think my last two reflections would be, again, like informed a little bit by what I thought was a really interesting finding from this UK government rapid assessment, was that they were basically saying a lot of migration that we see now is due to maladaptation, right? And I guess there's a big question of what is a maladaptation, but basically not well done adaptation policies or policies that don't really build resilience. And so I think finance, yes, but really also the question, like what kinds of policies and measures do we want to see at the local level, right? What in practice, how do you really make sure there is equity and vulnerable communities have a voice and it's not development for the 1%. And so I think the other question for civil society, it's maybe harder for local authorities because they have their existing jurisdiction, but I do think that a lot of the solutions really will require to start at the local level, but also to really look at the connections between places, right? Like to look at where are shared resources an issue that need responses that go beyond an existing jurisdiction, right? Like we can take adaptation measures maybe in one place, but they may be maladaptive for the next community over if we don't look at them together. And so I think like what are the geographies or what's the scale at which we really need to come together and find solutions so that we're not creating these negative side effects for others is going to be an important question. And that I think requires looking at interdependencies and connections across places, which is something that I think the migration community can very much bring to the climate community, right? This perspective of not just how do you work for your place, but how do you look across places and what connections to other places can bring to you and to your resilience building efforts. And then maybe my very last point would be around like the calls for women and for climate migrants, I'll call them that in a shorthand, to have a voice in decisions that affect them. I think the question very much is around organizing there, right? And who's organizing communities, affected communities, who's organizing affected people. And again, I think that we are really maybe marching towards a direction where organization is like no longer so based on these like national borders or existing jurisdictions, right? Like, but really on these questions more around like coastal communities being similarly affected, pastoralist communities being similarly affected, right? And this is something that we're trying to promote with the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative, where we're organizing a series of consultations more around these geographic lenses to really highlight that there are shared challenges across existing political boundaries, and we need to organize kind of across these political boundaries to address, make sure we learn across these different spaces. We replicate solutions across different spaces because communities face similar challenges. So I'll stop here and thank you again.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. We're going to move on in a little while to the Q&A portion. So I'd like to invite everyone to either use your raise hand function, which is at the bottom of your screen, or to indicate by asterisk. If you find it hard to look for that raise hand function, indicate by asterisk in the chat if you would like to speak. But first off, we have already 3 participants raising their hands, but because we are starting the Q&A a little bit earlier, I'd just like to maybe ask our speakers to just, comment on one important reflection that we would also like them to comment on. For Mr. Takar, we'd like to ask you if you are observing that there is increased working relations and cooperation between the local government, the government in Madhya Pradesh, and civil society organizations and community organizations in your state, and also a little bit of an example of how women's participation and their agencies also being promoted. And then for Sarah, do you think the mayors that you have been working with are also increasingly appreciating that it's important to be working closely with civil society organizations and especially enabling women? So while we collect more names of participants from the session who wants to ask questions. Maybe you'd like to give a minute to respond to these questions. Mr. Takar?
Okay, thank you for asking this question. As far as this role of civil society and community-based organizations are concerned, they have been playing a very crucial role in social economic development and also in environmental conservation. When it comes to understand the role of the civil society and community-based non-governmental organizations, I would just like to give an example of the program that was supported by World Bank on poverty alleviation. And one of the indicator of these, most of these socio-economic programs in Madhya Pradesh and of course in other states also, is that how can we contain the forced migration from rural areas to urban areas. If we are able to contain those migrations, I think the objectives of the interventions are achieved to a certain extent. In that context, I would like to inform that the role of the NGOs in bringing the poor people from the poverty line and bring about some kind of quality change in their life was commendable when we carried out this World Bank supported program on poverty alleviation. When it comes to women's, most of the socio-economic programs are now being, the role of the self-help groups of women's are being, acknowledged, but not only acknowledged, but government is giving directives to most of the departments to make use of the strength and the resource of self-help groups led by the women's. And in those groups, women's are taking lots of initiatives with regard to their livelihoods and increase of their income. So therefore, there is a very strong synergy of civil society and also women group in overall socio-economic development, reducing the poverty, and also to see that how the climate-induced environmental stressed migration is contained to a certain extent. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Takar. Sarah, would you like to give a few comments on how mayors are responding to civil society, working with civil society?
Yeah, thanks, Lily. And I think there's two levels. One is like what the cities are doing at the city level in terms of working with civil society to both advance climate action and migration. And then I think there's the kind of advocacy that they're doing both nationally and internationally. On the first part, my impression is that not much would happen in cities if it wasn't for collaboration with civil society, especially on the migration side. But I think it's also true on the climate side. A lot of mayors are really banking on the youth movement, for example, now being a vocal advocate for some of the measures that they want to take. They're also trying to build tables with the labor movement increasingly to have a conversation around just transition. But also, like we've heard, for example, from Accra in Ghana, where they're looking at waste management and how to make that more sustainable, and working with informal waste pickers to see, how do we use this, let's say, greening of the waste sector also as a way to formalize this workforce and make sure they are part of that transition. The city of Bristol has been really vocal about needing to diversify the climate movement, and so has been supporting Black residents of Bristol to become ambassadors for climate and environmental action, and really trying to raise awareness around the whiteness of the climate movement, and that it is not representative of all the city residents. So I think there's different levels in terms of the advocacy at the international level. My sense is that this mayor's mechanism, civil society dialogue is probably one of the avenues to create that interface. And as I said, I feel like there's quite a bit of convergence. So it would be probably worthwhile also to see towards COP, like, what are some of the key joint messages that could be elevated in advocacy there.
Yes. Thank you, Sarah. We have now 5 colleagues who would like to ask some questions or share some comments. So first we have Mamadou. Please go ahead. You can unmute your mic, Mamadou. Do you have a question? Your hand is raised.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I would like to congratulate the presentation and all the organization of this course. And yeah, I'm from Guinea-Bissau, that is West African small country, but currently I'm studying in Brazil. And we have, like in my original country, almost 100 islands and a very huge coastal area. And my perception on this aspect is that there is a lot of international agreements and documents that the government sign and make their compromise on achieving these goals. But in reality, what I see, at least from my country, it's that these small states have another kind of preoccupations or another problems, like to make their public administrations to work and stuff like that, or pay to pay the salary for their workers and stuff like that. So small communities have been troubling with these problems, and it seems that the state simply didn't know how to move forward and attend these international agreements. So my question is that how to build more realistic and achievable goals for both high and low income countries in order to make everybody in conditions to attend these compromises. Thank you.
Thank you, Mamadou. We'll ask one more participant to express his question or comment before we ask our panel to respond, and then we'll take 2 more and so on. So the second is from Mr. Faiz Tan. Does he still want to speak? Because I think he lowered his hand already. If not, we'll take the question from Mr. Musharuddin. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Go ahead.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Actually, am I audible?
Yes. Go ahead.
My question is to Mr. Takar, and he's from Madhya Pradesh, and I'm from West Bengal, India. So he told that the contribution of climate change on the backwardness of socio-economic conditions of the people in the states. So what is the, and how did he measure the contribution of migration change, and along with other factors, maybe government policy, maybe other many more factors. So what is the ratio of migration climate change to the backwardness of the people of the state? So how do you measure it? This is my question. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. So maybe we'll take a third one before we ask our panel to respond. What I can see is Miss Lare Turia from the list. Did I pronounce it right? Go ahead.
Oui, can I speak in Arabic or French?
You have to check your interpretation. There's a globe
I speak
icon there.
Arabic.
Okay, I think you can choose Arabic.
Yeah, I'm from Morocco.
Yeah, can you click on the Arabic so that we can also hear the English translation? Thank you.
I have clicked, but I didn't have interpretation. I'm following you in English, but I can't do my interpretation, my intervention in English.
You can speak. You can speak.
Yeah.
No problem.
أنا أريد أن أتكلم عن النساء وقضية التغيرات المناخية وكذلك الانعكاسات السلبية على حياة النساء بالنسبة للقارة كلها، وخصوصا بالنسبة للمنطقة التي أنتمي إليها وهي المغرب، وكذلك دول المينا يعني الشرق الأوسط وشمال إفريقيا. في الحقيقة بالنسبة لهذا الموضوع لا يحتل حيزاً جد مهم بالنسبة للجمعيات النسائية وكذلك النساء في النقابات، لأننا ولا كذلك في السياسات العامة ولا بالنسبة للبرلمانات، بحيث إذا رأينا حجم الأسئلة التي توضع في البرلمانات حول التغيرات المناخية فهي جد قليلة، وهذا ناتج لماذا؟ ناتج لعدم يعني قدرات التتبع ديال الجمعيات النسائية لهذا الموضوع. وعندما أتكلم عن الجمعيات النسائية فيها المجتمع المدني وكذلك ممثلين الجمعيات الهجرة، ولهذا فأنا أطلب أن يكون بالنسبة لنا في المغرب أن يتملك هذه الجمعيات هذا الملف، ولكن نحن وأقولها يعني في حاجة إلى تقوية القدرات. كيف يمكننا أن نرافع في الموضوع، كيف يمكننا أن نشتغل في الموضوع. فنحن اشتغلنا يعني عندما كانت هناك الكوب 21 وكذلك الكوب 22 وتتبع، لكن هو تتبع ليس له صدى كبيرا على مستوى البلاد وعلى مستوى جمعيات المجتمع المدني. وأنا أسجل إيجابيا النقطة التي تكلمت عنها السيدة سارة، وهي حوار المجتمعي وحوار المجتمع المدني مع الفاعلين الحكوميين حول قضايا التغيرات المجتمعية، وكيف يمكننا أن نصدر وأن يكون عندنا هناك بدائل كنساء لوضعها وللتفاوض عليها وللترافع عليها بالنسبة للسياسيين وبالنسبة للحكومات. شكرا، انتهيت من التدخل.
Thank you very much. So we're going to, at this point, ask our panelists to respond to the comments and questions so far, and we will call the rest after this first response. So Mr. Takar, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thank you. I couldn't understand the comments made by the speaker who just spoke just now, because there was some problem in translation. But coming back to the question of the speaker who talked about the studies, how do we measure the impact of climate change and how many people are getting migrated? Frankly speaking, we have not carried out any study to measure. But if you look at the independent studies and studies carried out by various other organizations, they all suggest, and which is visible also, that climate-induced migration is a reality of time. And if we are not awakened to this problem of climate change, many more people will have to leave their places. As of now, we have not carried out any study relating to migration and climate change. but it suggests that climate-induced migration is happening. That is what I want to say.
Thank you. Sarah?
Thanks. If I understand correctly, I think there was, on the one hand, a question of like awareness raising and how do you actually get different parts, let's say, of civil society to pay attention to the implications that climate and mobility may have for their struggle. And then there was also, I think, from the colleague from Guinea-Bissau, a question around capacity and how do you deal with local authorities that already maybe do not have a lot of capacity and to address these challenges. That's how I understood the questions. My sense is that one tool that I know has been used in Europe, and I don't know if it's a universally applicable model, but I think has been a way to put this on the agenda and get attention from politicians is through what they've called citizen assemblies. And of course, you already, I think, need some space and acknowledgement that that citizens, can and should deliberate some of these things, but where they basically try to formulate solutions through bringing ordinary citizens together. And so I think there are different models for how can you build awareness across different stakeholders. The city of Bristol organized a meeting where they basically just said, like, climate and migration, what does it mean for Bristol? And they invited a cross-section of the stakeholders that they have in Bristol, that they're working with in Bristol, to start exploring this issue. And so I think some of it is just probably starting the conversation, but then I think it ties in with some of the questions around, like, do you have some data to inform that kind of conversation? Is the data accessible to a broad range of people so that everybody can work with it? I think also on the capacity issue, I think we're right, and you stressed that, and we stressed that in the submission of the mayors, that this climate and migration cuts across so many different domains of policy making. At the same time, I feel like the resilience question comes down probably to pretty essential government functions, right? Like basic service delivery in a relatively good fashion. So it's not even that we need like sophisticated measures. Sometimes it's basically a fundamental basic infrastructure can probably enhance resilience in quite important ways. And so I think there's also a lot of cross like different investments from different sectors could actually serve the same goal. And so the capacity, I think, constraints are real, but they're also in a way, if you have a local plan, I think different finance sources could come together to build some fundamental capacities that can serve different agendas, if you will. I don't know if that's a helpful response, but I also think like local level is essential, but it can't work without other levels of government, right? You do need supportive national policies or regional level policies. And so it's not like local is important, but it can't work in isolation.
Thank you, Sarah. I have on my list as somebody whose name there is a Zoom user. So can we just request you to rename yourself first so we can call you by name? Meantime, I'm going to move to Salmanu Muhammad. Go ahead. So requesting the person that says Zoom user on his name, could you just rename yourself so we can identify you? Meantime, Salmanu, go ahead. Salmanu Muhammad, you have the floor.
Yes. Hello.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes. Good afternoon, all. I'm Salmanu Muhammad from Nigeria, from Wazobia International Women and Children Foundation, Nigeria. We really appreciate our teachers on how we are achieve some of this education of this migrant. But I have a question on climate change. How can climate change affect migrants? That is my question.
Okay, thank you, Salmanu. I'd like to call on next Muhammad Inshar Hassan. Go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon to you all. I'm delighted with you today in this crowd virtual class. I also really appreciate now for the expert moderators who are leading us through. I would like now to go ahead and start my question, which is goes like, for me, I am Muhammad Shah, one of brother in Somalia. To me, what I've noticed is Somalia has
Mohammed, I'm sorry, we cannot hear you very well. We cannot hear you very well. Could you repeat your question, please? There is some background noise. We cannot hear you very well.
Thank you. Good afternoon to you all. I'm really delighted to take a part in this virtual class today with you. I also appreciate the moderators who are now go through our lesson expertly. I would like now to stand on this question that I have, which deals with the climate change in Somalia. The climate change in Somalia has impacted the life of migrants, which has caused many people to migrate now from the rural areas to the urban centers, which greatly also impacted the crop productivity of the local community, which entirely affected the livelihoods of many people. So how does the world face such scenarios, and what are the possible solutions that the local, national, or international associations could face such problems? Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. We'd like to call on next Akim Anwar. And then we ask the panel to respond, and then we call on the next set of participants who have questions or comments. Akim Anwar, go ahead.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly.
Okay, great. I am Akim from Bangladesh. I had the opportunity to work with climate-induced migrant workers and community people in southeast part of Bangladesh. So when we actually tried to conduct some policy advocacy consultations, then we found that there is a misunderstanding between migration experts and activists and environmentalists. Like we migrant activists, we sense all natural disasters, disaster items like flood, cyclones, salinity, and other issues as climate change impacts, where environmentalists and some cross, as this is a very much cross-domain policy dialogue. So some of the other actors, they think that these are not actually climate change related issues. These are very much natural disaster related issues like flood, and they took all these as a complex phenomena where there should be empirical data, and as in for migration, there are so many variables, like there are so many decision-making actors and factors. It's not only the climate change or natural disasters. So in that case, how it is possible, or what approach we should take to convince those other stakeholders that, okay, these are not merely natural disaster events, rather these are also included or related as climate change issue, because it's a matter of securitization, how we will actually securitize this issue as a climate change issue, or so my question is how we can actually minimize this gap between migration experts, migration activists, and environmentalists. Thank you.
Thank you, Akim. We'll ask our panelists to respond now, and then we will call on the next set of questions. So, Sarah, would you like to start off this round?
Sure, and I'll take the last question first around, and I think it ties in with a question from the gentleman from Nigeria around, like, how does climate change affect migrants, at least partially. I've heard the same conversations around, is it accurate to say climate migration? Should we be speaking about environmental migration? Because not all disasters or environmental events are related to climate change or can be attributed to climate change. And so it would be more accurate to speak of environmental migration than climate migration. My sense is that invoking climate as a factor in migration has a political purpose in the sense that it opens the question of climate justice and of global responsibility. And so I think there's a deliberate choice to frame this issue around climate. But I also think that in individual contexts, it probably is necessary to follow the science and get a sense of when is an environmental event actually related to climate and when can you not make that attribution. So I don't know if we can convince the environmental community in that sense. But I think the choice of choosing climate is very much also a question of, where do we want to attribute responsibility? One question obviously is and I think another concern that I've heard is, if we, let's say, frame everything in terms of climate change, do we let local and national governments too much off the hook for bad policy choices that they make that may, cause environmental degradation, land degradation, and that may basically, accelerate areas becoming less livable or less habitable for people. So I think this is always tricky, where do you attribute responsibility and where have bad choices been made, if you will. I don't think it's one or the other. I think we have to keep both in the picture, right? There's the macro picture of climate action that needs to happen, and then I think there is the responsibility at the local and national level for good policy choices. And so, does climate change directly affect migrants? I think it is usually intermediated through environmental factors, and it affects them not just in terms of driving movements, but then often where migrants settle. And I think this speaks to what the gentleman from Somalia asked in terms of rural-urban migration. Oftentimes, we know that migrants, when they go to cities, settle in areas that are very vulnerable to climate impacts. So in, close to the coast, areas that are prone to flooding or to mudslides or erosion. So migrants are often vulnerable also once they've moved and they're at a place of destination where there isn't much land available for them to settle. And so they settle in places that are hazardous. And part of, I think, the challenge for city planners is to how, on the one hand, do you make space for new arrivals and don't just evict them from places, but at the same time make sure they're safe and they're not settling somewhere where they're going to be hit by the next disaster or repeated disasters. So I think that's one of the challenges that cities are facing and planners, especially as some African cities have highlighted to us, when they don't have locally the authority to do land use planning, right? Like they're not in charge of doing zoning and land use planning. And so then it's even harder to make sure that some areas are off limits for new developments, for example. And I think on the rural side, there was a question of like, you know, what do you do to diversify livelihoods and help people stay, basically? I think there is a lot of effort going into that, to be honest. I don't know if there's any real good evidence on what works and what doesn't. And again, I think that's where exchange across similarly situated communities could be very useful, but also thinking around rural-urban ties, right? Like, so not just how do cities deal with people moving into cities, but also how do cities think about their role with regard to the rural areas where people are coming from? So I think there's some I think we need to do some shift in our thinking in terms of not just thinking about each place in isolation, but again, like how are they connected and how does migration connect these places?
Thank you, Sarah. Mr. Takar, would you like to respond as well?
I think Sarah has very comprehensively addressed the issue, so I'd rather keep quiet on this issue.
Okay, so we'll just take the next set of questions. I'll call on Mr. Zoom user. Would you like to type your name on the chat so we can call you? Or you can take the floor now. I can see you, the video. Go ahead. Mr. Zoom user, you can take the floor. I don't know that he knows how to unmute or if he knows that I'm calling him now. Please go ahead and take the floor. Well, go ahead, Mr. Zoom user. If not, if you won't take the floor yet, I'd like to call on Patricia. Go ahead, Patricia.
Hi, thank you to both speakers for your insights so far. My question is quite a follow-up to one of the points brought up earlier about the different roles CSOs may play in the bigger scheme. So my question is, what roles can CSOs play to create synergy between individual and local levels and the bigger global agendas at addressing climate-induced migration? So in the global agendas we have seen so far, like the Paris Agreement, I think we saw a lot of difficulty in enforcing the provisions. So in that case, some CSOs have served to push back against some government authorities rather than working with them in those political agendas. So I'm wondering if both speakers could maybe comment on where exactly CSOs would see themselves in the next few years, maybe in creating more enforcement of these agendas. And second, how can they address this in the context of broader global inequality, so particularly in the gaps between developing and developed countries? So I think accountability is one of the big words that has been used so far, and I think first world countries in emissions, for instance, have been part of the discussion and the disproportionate effects it has in areas in developing countries with high poverty rates, as was discussed earlier. So I think the question that I really want to know about, I really want the speakers to speak more on is how to apply pressure to higher level political entities while also working in synergy with them. And yeah, I think we've already gotten to the point of the discussion, and I think we just want to elaborate more on those 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. I'd like to call on next Muhammad Azim. Go ahead, Muhammad.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I am from Bangladesh. Thank you for giving the floor. I also work for migrants people for 5 years. I would like to just mention that my previous speaker, Mr. Akim was nicely said that our policymakers don't give their attention in climate-induced migration. They escape this issue as the only environmental problem. But I am also a son of migrants family. My father went to Kuwait in 1985 because of our crop failure and other causes like riverbank erosion and landslide, etc. This is our in Bangladesh, especially in coastal area, regular problem, and that's why in these areas people are vulnerable. They have nothing to do except going abroad to secure their job in overseas. So I just want to put my question that our migration policy still is not related to environmental causes of migration. We know that there are many push and pull factors, but if we look into the push factors related to climate problem, so our policy, how we can ensure our policymakers' attention to give importance on climate-induced migration from coastal area of Bangladesh, especially from Chittagong, which is a port city of Bangladesh. But in these areas, coastal areas, people nothing to do migrate, and this is the problem that we cannot support them to relocate in other areas. So that is the problem. How can we attract policymakers' attention on climate-induced migration in these areas? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Since we only have two others who are raising their hands, I'd like to call on them now and then ask our speakers to respond, and then we might take some questions from the chat if we have more time. So the next is Mr. Oduyingbo. Did I pronounce that right? You have the floor, Oduyingbo. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Hello, hear me?
We cannot understand the yeah, go ahead.
I'm Nigeria. My question is there any
apologies? Oduyingbo, apologies. We cannot understand. Your sound is not coming through clearly. Can you try again? No, we cannot understand. Perhaps you should close your video. That might help the sound. We cannot hear you clearly, so maybe you should close your video. Okay, so that might help with the sound. Go ahead. Yes.
Okay, can you hear me now? Is there any migration policy that caters for migrants on the grounds of climate change? That's my question.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any? Okay.
Yeah, we got it. Is there any policy that caters to climate change and migration on the ground? right? We'll
Yes.
call on Miss, we'll call on Feisitan. Makinwa, Feisitan, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Really, I'm speaking from Nigeria, and I'm actually interested. I want to say this. Most of the time, migration that is informed by conflict, displacement by conflict, and some other things, and when people turn up as refugees, there's always special consideration for them. But there are a lot of people who are forced to move or displaced by natural occurrences, by climate change. And in most cases, when this happens, remember, they are not people who their movement is not voluntary. So it is not, so adaptation becomes a problem, because they really, if not for the climate change or for natural occurrences, they would have loved to stay where they are, where they are culturally domiciled. They will be okay there. But in a place like Africa, where our borders are rather fluid borders, and you find transnational movements based on climate change and environmental factors, I want to ask, what are the, I'm interested I'm directing this to Sarah. You're working with the African Union, but I want to find out, where is the place of the civil societies here? Because they are mostly the ones that are in connection and in engagement with the local people. So where is the place of the civil societies in getting it, in the larger picture? I want to know. I'm directing that question to Sarah.
Okay, so we have 3 more questions, but we'll take them. If there's still time, we'll just ask our panelists to answer to the set of questions they just heard. Mr. Takar, would you like to kick off the responses?
I think the last participant straight away asked a question to Sarah, so I won't comment on that. But some of the participants raised this question of community-based organizations, civil society organizations, their role, and how do we sort of address the question of global inequality. I just want to say that I can only speak from the area and country that I'm working from. So in this part of the world, and the governments, be it of any political affiliations or any political ideology, their entire effort is to, even if they talk, and actually they can't afford to speak anything which is not in favor of inequality, removing inequality. So most of the parties and governments, they are trying to make, how do we reduce the inequality in the society? So I'm a government servant. I've been working in government for the last 30 years. And I've seen that gradually governments have become more sensitive towards the civil society organizations, their role, their involvement in all kinds of activities that we do. And also this consciousness is already there since time beginning, inception, that how do we reduce the inequality in the society. So, but challenges are becoming more and more stronger. 20, 30 years before, climate change was not a challenge. But today, if you look at climate change, has become posing a great challenge. Difficult. So this is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Takar. Sarah?
Thank you, and thank you to Feisitan for giving me a really good opportunity to talk a little bit about the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative. Basically, I don't have obviously an answer for how structurally can you gain better civil society space in Africa. I'm sure there are lots of entry points, but the initiative wants to create space for civil society to be part of the process. What we're doing at the moment is putting together a report. It's based on research that is both field research with communities in Africa, but also modeling that Columbia University in the US is doing around potential scenarios for how Africa could be impacted by climate and what that could mean for people moving. And what we want to do starting in November is take these research inputs and have consultations with broad range of stakeholders to analyze them, to make sense of them. And then in a next step, next spring, to formulate policy recommendations, again, with a broad range of stakeholders involved, so that next year we have a report. And then based on that report, we want to develop an agenda for action for the next decade. So what do African policymakers at different levels, from the continental level to the local level, but also international partners, need to do to address these issues? So I would welcome very much, I put my email already in the chat, but we can also maybe through the organizers, make sure that those of you who have an interest in being part of this process, contact me so we can make sure you are on our contact list and we can keep you engaged on this. So thank you for that little plug. Quickly on the question of how do we raise awareness, I do think that organizing across different geographies can be a powerful voice. Like we've spoken about kind of, can we have an alliance of low-lying communities, for example, right? Like, can we have them come together and say, like, this is the challenges that we're facing and this is the response that we need. So that would be my plea. I'm not saying this is the silver bullet, but I think it would be one way of really raising awareness about particular challenges that communities are facing with climate impacts.
Thank you, Sarah. With apologies to J. Mark, Anite, and Murtala, I think we've run out of time now to entertain questions on the floor. If you would like to type your questions on the chat, then the organizers can forward your questions to our speakers. There's also a couple of interesting questions on the chat page that I'd like to invite Mr. Takar and Sarah to also look at. In the meantime, just to say that we are now close to the point where we will be asking Colin to give his closing remarks, but we would like to give Mr. Takar and Sarah the opportunity to give their final word to this session, to our participants. Mr. Takar?
Thank you. It has been a very enlightening, very engaging conversation, and I was going through the chat box also, where I'm sort of trying to respond to their queries. Although I don't work in migration sector, I'm working on climate change for the last 13-14 years, but this is very close to my heart. Recently, we saw huge people migrating in the COVID times because of these the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of people in India migrated from cities to rural areas to their home, and we have seen their difficulties, their adversities, and their pathetic conditions. And we have also seen how civil society, how people at large, how governments, all of them have come to help them, to support them. There was a problem and there was solutions. So always, I don't take always it as a negative thing that people are forced to migrate and nobody is doing anything. There are cultures and there are traditions and there are civil society organizations which have been coming forward to support people who have been migrating from urban areas to rural areas to going to their home, that we have seen during the pandemic. So, but I just want to say it again, which I said in my opening remarks, that migration is not a problem. The problem is that when people don't want to migrate, but they are forced to migrate, that is where the problem occurs. And this is where we have to make some intervention so that we can contain this kind of forced migration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah.
I feel like I've spoken a lot, and I really amazed by, you know, the cross section of people here. I think that's wonderful, like to see, you know, how many different countries are represented and people from different backgrounds. And I would actually love to hear more from, you know, different questions and experiences. I think it's quite heartening to see that there is this, I don't know, I feel like we're on a good trajectory, not in the sense that we have solved the problem at all, but I feel like the amount of awareness that I see has increased dramatically over the last couple of years. I'm based in the United States, and the conversations around like what needs to happen within the US around climate migration and what that might mean for communities is becoming, you know, very vocal. And so I was surprised to see this really rise. And I feel like the media attention has grown a lot to this issue. So that doesn't mean that the work is done, obviously, but I do think that there is a real opportunity to raise this, and maybe we should really put our sights on COP27, right? Like opening the door a little bit at this COP, which I think will spend more attention on adaptation than originally foreseen, and that's a good thing. But I think then really using the African COP in 2022 to position this issue front and center, and starting now to think about how different actors, the mayors, the civil society, states that are interested in this issue, the small island states that are, you know, facing this acutely, how do we bring them together for COP22 and really make this a center stage issue there? I think it's possible.
Thank you very much to our speakers. And I just like to end my role here, but by referring again to the same IPCC report that I referred to in the beginning. And one of the fourth message there that I'd like to emphasize is that as we acknowledge that climate change has already had tremendous devastating impacts on many people, on many sectors, including, and these are words that have already been used, internal displacement, climate refugees, climate-induced migration, whether internal or international. The report is warning us that even more horrific impacts are coming at us in the next few years, even before we can stabilize the climate. So we have to brace ourselves, and thus responses to climate change impacts are very, very urgent. And we need to take on this challenge as civil society, as governments, as different communities across the world being impacted by climate change. So I'd like now to hand it over to Colin to give us the closing remarks for this session. Thank you very much to all our speakers and all the participants, and the many important and interesting questions that are now posted at the chat. And I think several requests if there can be a circulation of the attendance lists for further networking among our participants, which is a very impressive number of more than 300. Thank you. Over to you, Colin.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lydia. And yes, we've always been really, really blessed and very grateful for all the people who have been participating through these different sessions over this many months of the People's Migration Challenge. But I want to say again, a big thank you to both of our speakers today, and thank you, Lokendra and Sarah, for all that you've brought to the discussion. I think this is really exciting to hear, both at the local municipal level, what's being done, the different initiatives, but also the connection being made to migration. We heard a number of questions come up about this, like what's the link to migration? I think that's the underlying thing that we're trying to bring, the cross-sectionality between our movement in migration and around migrant rights, and what is happening in terms of the different challenges that is around the world. And climate is one of the most prominent ones these days. So I just really appreciate you bringing in those perspectives, and Sarah also to have a comparative view of different cities and different initiatives across. So we really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Liddy, a big thank you to you. Also always a pleasure to have you back, and we hope we can continue to work together towards Glasgow and beyond. I think we keep saying this, that it's so important to build movements across the different sectors, as much as we focus on our specific, migration or climate or debt or development or trade movements, but we need to build a people's movement, and a lot of these issues are really cross-cutting across our community. So we appreciate the effort to work together, and we look forward to that. To everyone, I just want to say that it's been a great pleasure to work in this round. We want to make a special thanks to our collaborators in this fourth round of the People's Migration Challenge, which is the GFMD Mayors Mechanism. A big thank you to Sophie, to Fatima, and others in the Mayors Mechanism who have been working with us to really bring in this kind of local authorities, mayors, cities perspective and initiatives, which to me has been very exciting and very interesting to learn about how much synergy there is with our sort of civil society movement. And we find that there's a lot of the initiatives, a lot of the things that you've been talking about have been so interesting to us because it resonates with a lot of what we're thinking at the civil society level. So we really hope it's been a great experience. We want to thank the Mayors Mechanism again and for that collaboration, and we hope we can continue to build on that towards the IMRF, towards other key initiatives as we work kind of in parallel, but also joining that together. On behalf of the co-organizers, which I just want to remember who are the ones that are co-organizing the PMC, the People's Migration Challenge: Alianza Americas, the Civil Society Action Committee, CCRM, CMPD, GRFDT, MFA, and PICUM. On behalf of the co-organizers, we want to thank everybody for joining us in this fourth round. This fifth session concludes this round, but stay tuned because we're coming back with the fifth round where we'll be looking to talk to national governments and how we bring a lot of what we've been discussing in these 4 rounds across these many months. We want to bring that and discuss that with national governments and how we can have those dialogues and the talking points, the one-pagers, the postcards that we've been circulating, and what we've learned in this round from representatives from mayors and city authorities and local authorities, how we can bring that to national governments in the next round, and with a focus towards the IMRF, but also a focus towards just transforming and building movements around these 5 key thematic areas. Stay tuned for that. So we have a lot of your emails now. So you've been receiving a lot of our PMC emails. So please look out for that as we do that. I want to end today and end this round by thanking again our co-organizers, all 5 or 6 organizations. A special shout out, a special thank you to Joanna Yu at MFA and Rakesh at GRFDT, who've been doing so much of the background work, or constantly kind of doing things in the background. We don't get to see them on screen so much, but they are the busiest ones in setting these up and helping us make sure that they all run smoothly. And it shows in the numbers, it shows in everyone participating here. I want to thank our co-organizers, all 5, 6 organizations. Big thank you to our interpreters from the Lebanese University in Beirut, the interpretation department there. You've been so supportive and so helpful in providing interpretation into 4 languages all the time, sometimes without coming in with different ideas and different viewpoints and different accents and different intonations on different words. So we really appreciate your working with us and support of this process as well. With that, we conclude. We thank you all again. Please stay tuned. Again, PMC will be back after taking a short break of 1 or 2 weeks, but we'll be back. Stay tuned for the announcements on that. Bye, everyone.